Just a nurse. That was what Dr. Sterling called her during the staff meeting the week before, his voice carrying the exact weight of a man who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of dismissal. Katie Morrison didn't flinch. She didn't look up from the medication cart she was organizing. She'd been called worse by better men, men whose voices still lived in her chest like shrapnel. They didn't know. Sterling didn't know. The 5 doctors who would refuse to help the dying man in room 407 didn't know they were standing 3 floors above a legend, someone whose hands had performed emergency needle decompressions 30 times in the dust and chaos of Sangin Valley while rounds of fire snapped past her head like angry hornets. They didn't know that on her left forearm, a colonel from Delta Force had her name tattooed in black ink the size of a fist, a man who would spend the next 72 hours sedated, unable to recognize her face, unable to remember the moment she dragged him 3 miles through gunfire to get him on a medevac bird. Sacred Heart Hospital at dawn was a study in controlled indifference. The cardiac ICU hummed with the white noise of ventilators and monitors, that particular fluorescent drone that made the hours feel like they were stretching sideways. Katie arrived for her shift at 6:27 a.m., 17 minutes early, the way she always did. Her hands trembled as she held her coffee in the break room, fingers wrapped around the paper cup like it might fall from her grip at any moment. The tremor wasn't from fear or fatigue. It was from 5 years of trying to live in a world that still moved too slowly, where the stakes felt impossibly small, where nobody was bleeding out and she could actually close her eyes without seeing the faces of men she'd tried to save and failed. The coffee was lukewarm. She'd been holding it for 4 minutes without taking a sip, watching the ripples in the liquid pattern themselves into shapes she recognized from flight patterns over Kandahar. She set it down on the counter. A single drop splashed onto the tile floor like a punctuation mark on a sentence she couldn't quite finish. By 7:03 a.m., Katie had moved through her station checks with the methodical precision of someone trained to inventory equipment in the dark. She counted suction catheters, 12 in the wall-mounted rack. She verified the crash cart medications by serial number. She checked the defibrillator battery level. The other nurses on night shift had already handed off their patients. They moved past her without much acknowledgement, the way people move past furniture. This was expected. Katie preferred it. When you carried classified memories in your chest, silence became its own kind of camouflage. The colonel in room 407 lay unconscious, his body a geography of decline. He'd been admitted 4 days ago with acute decompensated heart failure, ejection fraction at 18%, his massive frame reduced to something fragile beneath hospital white sheets. His left arm lay across his stomach, and above the fall line, just where the bicep curved, Katie could see the tattoo. Her name? Katie. 5 letters in military clean serif font, done by some corpsman with steady hands and a conscience. She'd never told him yes. He'd just decided one night in the forward operating base that if they both made it home, he was going to carry her name. He'd made it home. She'd made it home too, but she'd made it to a place where nobody asked questions, where she could hide in plain sight among the fluorescent lights and the beeping machines, where the only thing anyone called her was the night nurse with the steady hands. Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds at 8:15 a.m. with the kind of presence that made junior residents straighten their spines. He was 53, silver threading through his hair like platinum wire, his white coat hanging on a frame built by expensive gym memberships and the particular confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who could make it stick. Behind him came the residents and medical students, a procession of deference that followed him down the corridor the way smoke follows fire. Katie was already in room 407 when they entered, having just checked the colonel's last arterial blood gas results. His oxygen saturation was dropping incrementally, 88% on high-flow oxygen, and his lactate was climbing toward the danger zone. His heart was failing. Literally. Cardiomyopathy-induced systolic dysfunction with progressive deterioration despite maximum medical management. The textbook would say comfort care was the only option left. Katie knew the textbook was written by people who'd never held a dying man's hand while the medevac rotor wash shook the desert around them. "Gentlemen," Sterling said, his voice carrying that particular cadence of a man addressing an audience rather than colleagues, "we're looking at a NYHA class for case with ejection fraction below 20. This patient is beyond salvage. Palliative care consult has been placed. Family's been informed we're pursuing comfort-focused measures. He glanced at the chart without actually reading it, a gesture Katie had seen 100 times, the performative act of looking busy while already having decided the outcome. The Colonel's family is requesting a more aggressive approach, Katie said. Her voice was steady. Level. The kind of calm you develop when you've given sit-reps under fire. Sterling's jaw tightened, not noticeably, just enough to show he'd heard something he hadn't invited. The family is understandably emotional, he said, addressing the medical students around him, each word another small blade. What they're requesting isn't medically indicated. This patient needs compassionate end-of-life care, not experimental interventions. With respect, sir, Katie continued, his hemodynamics might stabilize with a temporary mechanical device. BiVAD support would bridge him to transplant evaluation. The criteria match. He's only 47. He's a candidate. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Sterling turned to face her directly. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who'd just found something he needed to correct. Nurse Morrison, he said, and something in the way he said her name made one of the residents take a small step backward. Are you a cardiothoracic surgeon? No, sir. Are you the consulting cardiologist? No, sir. Then I think we can allow the actual physicians in this room to determine the standard of care. He turned back to his students. This is an important lesson. Scope of practice exists for a reason. Clinical judgment comes from experience and training, not from. He paused, letting the ellipsis hang in the air like a word left unspoken but understood. Katie felt her jaw clench. Just once. Just that small rebellion. She didn't look away. She didn't step backward. She filed the feeling away in the same place she'd filed away every insult, every dismissal, every moment someone had mistaken her silence for compliance. What happened next changed the temperature of the room. The Colonel's daughter, Maya, had been standing in the corner near the window, a woman in her early 20s with her father's broad shoulders and a face carved by worry she was too young to carry. She'd heard every word. "He's my father," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "He's my father and he's right here." Sterling's expression shifted to something approximating sympathy, the way a reptile approximates fur. "I understand this is difficult," he began, but Maya wasn't finished. "He wrote that nurse's name on his arm," she said, pointing at Katie. The room became a painting. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Sterling's eyes went to the tattoo, then back to Katie, and something shifted in his calculation. A threat had materialized that wasn't there a moment before, a nurse who apparently held some significance to his patient that he hadn't accounted for. His response came swiftly. He pulled a tablet from the medical student beside him, scrolled to the digital version of the hospital's policy manual, found the exact section he wanted, and held it up like a photograph of evidence. "Scope of practice violation," he said quietly. "Patient advocacy is appropriate. Medical decision-making is not. We'll be documenting this as a formal incident report." He turned to the nurse manager standing in the doorway, a woman named Patricia who'd learned long ago that career preservation required alignment with whoever held the power. Posting on the unit board. And a copy to the state nursing board. He said it like someone ordering breakfast. Casual. Routine. Just procedure. Katie watched him write the report from his tablet, watched him use his thumb to sign his name digitally, watched the message reach its destination in the hospital system with the soft chime of a notification. She stood there in her scrubs, her trembling hands now pressed flat against her legs, her face arranged into an expression of professional neutrality that required every muscle in her body to maintain. The other nurses had already begun discovering reasons to be elsewhere. One remembered a patient call button she'd forgotten about. Another suddenly needed supplies from the storage closet. The break room cleared the way water clears from a drain. Sterling stayed a moment longer than was necessary. He handed the printed version of the incident report to Patricia, and his eyes held Katie's for exactly long enough to communicate that this was not finished. "Tell me something, Nurse Morrison," he said quietly, low enough that the medical students couldn't hear, high enough that he was sure she could. How many tattoos does that man have? Katie's hands were still trembling. This time, it wasn't weakness. It was the trembling that comes from holding something back, a force so large it requires all the discipline of her training just to contain it. She let one breath escape through her nose. One that I know of, sir. And yet, Sterling said, you're the only person on this unit acting like you're his personal physician rather than his nurse. He turned to leave, then paused. The pause was calculated. The colonel has my name tattooed on his left forearm, Katie said. Her voice dropped an octave. From Sangin Valley. From when I dragged him out of a firefight while his femoral artery was bleeding into his boot. The morphine won't let him remember that now. But his daughter does. She brought his combat boots from home because he wanted them nearby. So yes, sir. I'm acting like his personal physician because unlike the 5 doctors who've already told me they won't attempt the procedure that could save his life, I'm the only person in this hospital who remembers what it means to keep someone breathing when everything is trying to kill them. Sterling's smile never wavered. Hospital policy prohibits nurses from contradicting attending physicians during rounds, he said. That's documented now too. He walked from the room, and Patricia followed, and the medical students scattered like birds from a wire. The incident report was already copied to the State Board of Nursing. Katie could feel it traveling through hospital servers the way smoke travels through air, invisible, unstoppable, already changing the pressure of everything it touched. In room 407, the colonel's monitors beeped their steady rhythm. His saturation ticked down to 87%. And 5 doctors, Anderson, Patel, Chen, Rodriguez, and Garrett, were standing outside his room in a small cluster of defeated white coats, each of them already having made the decision that they wouldn't attempt the mechanical support that might have saved him. They were shaking their heads at nothing in particular. Just shaking their heads at the way the world worked, at the way a hospital hierarchy crushed any attempt at deviation, at the way a single voice from above could flatten 5 voices from below. Katie picked up the colonel's chart and began documenting his vitals with the precision of someone recording evidence. Her hands were steady now. Dr. Sterling's phone call came before sunrise. The charge nurse at the station found the text waiting on her screen when she clocked in at 5:51 a.m. Alert me immediately to any unauthorized interventions from Morrison. Any deviation from protocol. I need documentation. She read it twice, her jaw tightening, understanding that he wasn't asking for updates. He was asking her to become his surveillance camera. Katie didn't know about the text yet. She was in the break room at 6:15 a.m. with black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the opposite wall where someone had taped a motivational poster of a lighthouse. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above her head. She dressed in her scrubs like armor, navy blue, unremarkable, forgettable. Her badge clipped to her pocket felt heavier than it had yesterday. The disciplinary notice was already in her personnel file. She could feel it there, a physical weight, even though it was 3 floors up in administration. By 6:48 a.m., Dr. Sterling was making the first of his calls. The hospital board president answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. This better be an emergency, Sterling. It wasn't quite 7 a.m. The city of Savannah was still wrapped in grey pre-dawn light. It might be, Sterling said. His voice had that smooth, practiced quality, the kind of tone that made people listen because he sounded like someone who never wasted time with drama. We have a night shift nurse who's becoming a liability. Scope creep. Insubordination toward the attending physician. I've already documented one incident, but I wanted to give you a heads up before this escalates into a regulatory issue that reflects on Sacred Heart standards. The board president was awake now. How serious? Serious enough that I contacted her nursing school this morning to verify her training credentials. I want to understand if this is a knowledge gap or a psychological issue. That was the knife twist. Not an accusation, a question. Not a complaint, but concern about whether she was stable. Sterling had learned long ago that doctors didn't need to raise their voices. They just needed to plant seeds of doubt in the right soil and let other people water them. By 8:15 a.m., he'd called 3 reference contacts from Katie's graduating class at the University of Georgia School of Nursing. The conversations followed the same pattern. "I'm doing a routine competency review," he explained. "Can you tell me about Katie Morrison? Her stability? Any incidents that concerned the faculty?" The first contact didn't remember her. The second said she was quiet, kept to herself. The third, a professor named Dr. Chen who had taught advanced trauma assessment, said something that made Sterling's smile widen through the phone line. Actually, there were some concerns about her mental health trajectory. She was brilliant in theory but had some personal struggles during her clinical rotations. "I remember she took a leave of absence during her final semester. Family issues, I think." Sterling didn't need to hear more. The narrative was writing itself. By Tuesday morning, the outside risk management consultant was walking through the front entrance of Sacred Heart, carrying a leather portfolio that cost more than Katie's monthly rent. His name was Bernard Fitch, and he'd spent the last 14 years protecting hospitals from lawsuits by removing people before they could become liabilities. He had the relaxed confidence of someone who'd never been told no by an institution he was retained to advise. Sterling had done the groundwork perfectly. The consultant's arrival felt inevitable. By 10 a.m., Fitch had reviewed Katie's file, spoken to Sterling privately in his office, and prepared a termination letter on Sacred Heart letterhead. The language was clinical and airtight, following a performance improvement plan failure and documented scope of practice violations, effective immediately. Katie Morrison's employment as a registered nurse is terminated. The hospital reserves the right to report this matter to the South Carolina State Nursing Board. Katie was called to the administrative office at 10:36 a.m. while she was in the middle of charting vitals for the colonel, her hand steady, her focus complete. The charge nurse delivered the message with the apologetic tone of someone delivering bad news that wasn't her fault. "They're asking for you upstairs. Now." The walk to the 3rd floor took 90 seconds. Every step felt like water pressure building. She knew what was coming. She'd been trained in 17 different combat scenarios. She'd made life-or-death decisions under fire. But this particular kind of institutional execution had its own gravity. The office was sterile. White walls. A large wooden desk. Sterling stood near the window with his arms crossed, his suit pressed into absolute geometry. Bernard Fitch sat in a leather chair, his expression professionally neutral. A third person Katie didn't recognize, probably HR, held a folder. "Sit," Fitch said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Katie Saturday. The chair was too low, positioned deliberately so she had to look slightly upward at the desk. She'd learned these techniques in naval intelligence briefings. Positioning. Hierarchy. Breaking a person's sense of level ground. Fitch slid the termination letter across the desk. "Effective immediately, you're terminated for performance violations, scope of practice infractions, and insubordination toward attending physicians. You'll surrender your badge and hospital credentials. Security will escort you from the building." Katie picked up the letter. She read it, every word, every sentence structure, every carefully constructed phrase designed to make her sound unstable and dangerous. The paper felt thin in her hands, almost fragile, like it might dissolve if she breathed too hard on it. She didn't speak. Sterling watched her face, waiting for cracks. Waiting for tears or trembling or some kind of breaking. Katie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her breathing didn't change. She folded the letter once and set it back on the desk. "That's it," Sterling said. "No defense? No excuse." Katie stood. The movement was smooth, controlled, the way someone stands when they've practiced getting up from chairs 1,000 times without showing effort. "No," she said quietly. Fitch nodded to the HR representative, who produced a security escort who'd apparently been waiting just outside the office. The whole transaction took 6 minutes. Katie surrendered her badge, the one with her name and photo, the one that had opened doors for her for 18 months. She didn't look at Sterling as she left. There was nothing left to say. The institution had spoken. The decision was made. The narrative had been set. She was unstable, overreaching, a problem solved. By Wednesday afternoon, she was sitting in the waiting room of the Veterans Affairs Hospital in downtown Savannah, surrounded by a particular kind of silence that only existed in places where people had seen things that couldn't be unseen. A Marine Corps gunnery sergeant sat 3 chairs down, his left leg ending just below the knee, his eyes focused on nothing. An Army veteran in a wheelchair was reading a newspaper from 2 days ago. An older Navy sailor was staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Katie held the intake form. The question was simple: military service? Yes, no. Her hands trembled. Not from fear. From restraint. From the knowledge that checking that box meant opening a door she'd sealed shut with institutional erasure. It meant saying her name aloud. It meant admitting who she was. It meant becoming visible again. She couldn't do it. Not yet. Not with the colonel dying in Sacred Heart while 5 doctors stood outside his room and did nothing. Not with Sterling's voice still echoing through the hallways. Not with her boots still in a hospital locker because returning them meant accepting defeat. She left the form unchecked and handed it back to the receptionist. The receptionist, a woman who'd worked VA intake for 11 years, didn't comment. She'd seen this before. The veterans who couldn't yet claim their own names. The ones still running from who they'd been. Katie drove back to her apartment, a 1-bedroom above a Vietnamese restaurant where the smell of fish sauce and lemongrass leaked through her floorboards every evening. The combat boots were still in her locker at Sacred Heart. She didn't know how she'd retrieve them without encountering Sterling or security or some final institutional humiliation. They sat there like evidence of her former life, unworn, waiting for a soldier who no longer existed on any official documentation. She sat on her bed in the dark and didn't turn on the lights. Outside, Savannah's evening traffic moved past her window like a current she wasn't part of. Her phone remained silent. No one from Sacred Heart would call. Her former colleagues were already being told to avoid her, probably. Sterling would ensure of that. He had the institutional machinery behind him. He had the board president's ear. He had 5 doctors who'd chosen professional survival over their patient. By tomorrow morning, his work would be complete. She would be erased from every roster. The colonel would continue declining without intervention. And Dr. Sterling would return to his rounds, satisfied that order had been restored and that the hierarchy, the one that kept him at the top, the one that ensured his authority was never questioned, remained intact and undisturbed. What he didn't know was that erasure doesn't end a person. It just changes what they become. The colonel's monitor showed the first warning sign at 0247. A subtle dip in oxygen saturation. Nothing alarming by itself, 72%, still technically viable, but Katie knew better than to trust stability in a man on high-dose morphine with no surgical intervention. She'd seen this pattern before in Sangin. The body's last negotiation with death. The room smelled like antiseptic and something else underneath it. Resignation. The kind of smell that came when 5 attending physicians had already decided your patient wasn't worth saving. Sterling's standing orders were laminated on the supply cart in the ICU. Katie had watched the charge nurse post them at 1800 hours. Nurse Morrison is not authorized to perform any procedures beyond basic care on any patient without direct physician supervision. The words might as well have been written in blood. They'd been spoken that way, that flat, administrative voice that made cruelty sound like policy. 5 doctors had refused the mechanical support procedure. Anderson. Patel. Chen. Rodriguez. Garrett. All gone home by midnight, their refusal documented in the chart, leaving the colonel to comfort care and whatever morphine could do. Katie checked his vitals at 0300 and the world shifted. The chest wall rigid. Trachea deviating sharply to the right. Oxygen saturation 58 and dropping like a stone through dark water. Tension pneumothorax. Air escaping from the right lung, collapsing it, pushing against the mediastinum, choking off the blood return to his heart. The monitor showed tachycardia first, heart rate climbing past 140, then the rhythm destabilized into something between panic and physics. A body fighting the laws that govern survival. The on-call resident, Dr. Garrison, was a third year who'd spent the last 4 hours sitting in the physician's lounge reviewing PowerPoint slides about grief and letting go. He froze when Katie pressed the call button. His hands went white at the knuckles. She could see him calculating probabilities that all led to death, and in that calculation, to liability. To Sterling's wrath. To questions about why a resident had authorized anything when the department head had already made it clear, this patient was palliative care only. Katie moved to the crash cart without asking permission. Muscle memory didn't ask permission. It was a separate thing, her hands and her military training, and her mind just watched them work like she was observing someone else. The 14-gauge needle sat exactly where it should be, right side of the crash cart, second drawer, underneath the 18-gauge for slower infusions. 2 inches long. Bevel tip. The kind of needle that made a specific sound when it penetrated skin. Not a sound most people recognized. But Katie had made that sound 42 times in 17 different firefights. The sound of air escaping. The sound of a body deciding to live. The colonel gasped. His mouth opened in that reflex way, the brain screaming for oxygen, the lungs collapsed and useless. The monitors screamed with him, heart rate 156, oxygen 47, blood pressure collapsing toward nothing. This wasn't a decision anymore. This was 90 seconds until cardiac arrest. Katie located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical landmark that every combat medic learned or watched people die from ignorance. Her fingers found the space between ribs like they were reading Braille. The needle was cold. Stainless steel held in her palm, and she could feel the precise resistance of skin. One motion. Controlled. No hesitation, because hesitation is what kills people. The needle advanced through skin, through fascia, through the parietal pleura, and then the hiss. Air escaping. Air that had been slowly murdering the colonel's right lung, collapsing it centimeter by centimeter. The hiss was clean. Satisfying in a way that only medical professionals understood. The sound of physics correcting itself. The sound of biology getting a second chance. The colonel's oxygen saturation climbed. 51, 63. 74, 88. The tachycardia began to settle. The heart rate dropped from 156 to 127 to 98. The monitors found their rhythm again. Sinus rhythm. The kind of sound the brain recognized as meaning alive. The colonel gasped again, but this time it was the gasp of someone who'd just remembered how to breathe. The whole intervention lasted 43 seconds. Dr. Garrison's hands had started shaking. He stared at the colonel's oxygen saturation, now holding steady at 91, like he was watching a resurrection he wasn't qualified to comprehend. No one had told him that this was possible. No one had told him that a nurse with steady hands and tactical training could save a patient that 5 doctors had abandoned. The physician's lounge hadn't covered this in the grief PowerPoint. Katie didn't wait for congratulations. She didn't wait for permission or validation or the standard medical theater that accompanied most procedures. She was already moving to the medication cabinet, drawing up 1 milligram of epinephrine, securing the medication in a standard 4-push. The colonel's blood pressure needed support. The body was still in shock. The intervention had stopped the pneumothorax, but survival meant managing everything it had damaged on the way in. The charge nurse appeared in the doorway at 0304. Just appeared. Like she'd been waiting for something to go wrong. Her expression shifted when she saw what had happened, the settled monitors, the colonel's chest rising and falling properly, Katie standing at the medication cabinet with the authority of someone who'd already made the decision that mattered. "I'm calling Dr. Sterling," the charge nurse said. It wasn't a threat. It was protocol. It was fear dressed up as procedure. "Call whoever you want," Katie said. She didn't look at the nurse. Tell him the patient's breathing again. Sterling arrived at 0309 with his phone already in his hand, his expression already prepared for insubordination. He'd been 10 minutes away, which meant he'd been closer than he should have been at 0300 in the morning. He'd already given standing orders about Katie. He'd already positioned people to alert him if she moved. This wasn't alertness. This was a trap waiting for her to either stay silent and watch a patient die, or break his rules and give him the excuse he needed to destroy her completely. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved from the monitors to the colonel's chest to Katie's hands to the empty needle wrapper on the medication cart. She'd left the wrapper there deliberately. A confession. Proof. Evidence of everything he needed. Sterling's smile was the worst thing about him. It was the smile of someone watching a calculation work out perfectly. The smile of a man who'd orchestrated a situation so thoroughly that any action the nurse took became the wrong one. Speak up, and she was insubordinate. Stay quiet, and she let the patient die. Do the procedure, and she violated standing orders. Do nothing, and she failed at the fundamental mission of medicine. The smile meant he'd won. The smile meant he'd seen this coming the entire time. Walk outside, Sterling said. His voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that came with authority so absolute it didn't need volume. Now. Katie looked at the colonel once more. His eyes were closed, but his chest was rising and falling in that steady rhythm that meant the lungs were working again. The combat boots were still on the bedside table. His daughter had brought them from home and left a note. He always wants these nearby. They sat there like some kind of oath. Some kind of promise that if he survived the night, maybe he'd remember why. Katie walked into the hallway. Sterling closed the door softly behind them. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical song, and in that fluorescent space, he began to speak with the precision of someone laying charges that would stick. His phone was already in his other hand. She could see his thumb hovering over the screen, ready to make calls, ready to document this moment, ready to transform her act of mercy into evidence of her instability. You just performed a surgical procedure without authorization, he said. 10 words exactly. Counted and measured. On a patient under my care, against explicit written protocol, in violation of scope of practice, and in direct contradiction of standing medical orders. Katie's composure had cracked before. In 2009, when the medevac helicopter went down and she couldn't save the pilot. In 2011, when she lost an entire squad in an ambush that lasted for minutes. But not like this. Not in fluorescent hallway light while a man with institutional power calculated how to weaponize her mercy. She didn't speak. Speaking would give him more ammunition. Speaking would let him finish his case. Her silence was the only defense she had left. But that wasn't the worst part. The doors to room for 12 opened at 7:44 a.m. Thursday morning, and with them came a man in handcuffs flanked by 2 State Department security officers whose dark suits looked pressed from a Pentagon briefing. The former Taliban fighter was thin, angular, his ribs visible even under the hospital gown they'd given him. His asylum case had triggered additional federal scrutiny overnight, FBI now, State Department now, a classified file thick enough to require a special reading room. Katie was checking his vitals when his eyes snapped to her face. His breath caught. He stared for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then his voice came out sharp and fractured in broken English. You are the American devil woman from Sangin Valley. You killed my brother. And saved the screaming colonel. The words hung in the fluorescent lit air like smoke that wouldn't disperse. Katie's hand didn't shake on the blood pressure cuff. Her eyes didn't waver. She finished the reading, 142/81, elevated but expected, and marked it on the chart with the same mechanical precision she'd used for 18 months while hiding. The security officer stepped forward immediately, his radio crackling to life, and he pulled the colonel's classified file from the lockbox they'd brought in that morning. Protocol. Always protocol. The State Department liaison entered behind him, a woman with reading glasses on a silver chain and the bearing of someone who'd briefed ambassadors. She opened the diplomatic packet to verify the asset's claims about cooperation. The first document was Katie's after-action report from Sangin province, dated March 15, 2011. Her photograph was attached. Unclassified now, which meant someone high enough on the chain had decided America wanted this declassified, wanted this truth out into the world. The colonel's daughter stood in the hallway with her hand pressed against the window. She'd been reading over the liaison's shoulder. Her voice broke when she spoke, the careful composure of someone who'd kept her father alive on machines for 3 weeks finally fracturing into something raw. Senior Chief Petty Officer. 2 words. That was all it took. The daughter's eyes filled and she looked directly into room 412, directly at Katie, and understanding crashed across her face like a wave. Katie was still holding the blood pressure cuff. Her hands were steady. Her face was stone. But something shifted in the hallway then, a sudden density in the air, a pressure change that made the fluorescent light seem to buzz louder. The State Department liaison turned the page. Katie Morrison, Naval Special Warfare Combat Medic, attached to JSOC Operations, Sangin Province, date range 2009 through 2012. Her service record spilled across 4 pages in clinical language designed to convey heroism without emotion. Treated 12 casualties under direct fire. Coordinated medevac under mortar attack. The liaison's finger traced down to the next section and she read aloud to the security officers. Senior Chief Morrison neutralized for enemy combatants while providing simultaneous medical care, sustaining 2 gunshot wounds herself. Katie finished the vitals check on the former fighter and turned to leave the room. That was when she heard it. A voice behind her in the hallway, low and steady, carrying the weight of someone who'd earned the right to speak authority into existence. Bronze Star with Valor for treating 12 casualties under direct fire. The Navy SEAL team leader, Commander Holloway, had been in the hallway for his own VA appointment, just walking past, and he'd stopped cold when he saw the diplomatic packet. He was a big man, 6'2", shoulders broad enough to make the hallway feel smaller. Katie had never met him before, but she recognized the look in his eyes because she'd seen it in mirrors, the recognition of someone who'd lived through things that couldn't be unsaid. He stepped closer to the reading group, his eyes scanning the document over the liaison's shoulder. 2 purple hearts, one from the Sangin extraction operation. His voice rising slightly, not a question. A confirmation. Katie turned to walk toward the stairwell. Her stride didn't break. But she could hear the pages turning behind her, could hear that unmistakable rustle of classified documents being revealed in a hospital hallway where anyone could walk past. The SEAL commander's voice followed her. Navy Cross for carrying Colonel James Whitmore 3 miles under enemy fire after his helicopter went down. Katie's hand found the stairwell door handle. She didn't open it yet. She listened. She always listened. The liaison's voice now, reading from the summary section, Senior Chief Morrison coordinated the extraction of 7 personnel under sustained Taliban attack, providing tactical medical support while under fire, sustaining 2 additional gunshot wounds during the extraction. The SEAL commander stepped directly in front of the diplomatic file, blocking the rest of the hallway from viewing it. His voice was loud enough now that people 3 rooms away could hear. The ghost of Sangin, that's what JSOC called her. She saved 17 lives in a single engagement. A pause. How many of you knew you were working next to a legend? The colonel's daughter made a sound like a sob, but it wasn't despair. It was the sound of pieces connecting, of a story finally making sense. Her father had survived 3 weeks on machines because somewhere deep in his sedated brain, he'd been clinging to a name tattooed on his own arm. Senior Chief Katie Morrison. The hiss of air from the tension pneumothorax at 3 a.m. The hands that had been steady enough to save him when 5 doctors had already written him off as dead. When protocol had already surrendered him to comfort care and a slow fade into nothing. Katie opened the stairwell door. That was when she saw Dr. Sterling at the far end of the hallway near the elevators. His face had gone the color of hospital walls, not pale, but somehow emptied, drained of the blood and certainty that had driven his campaign against her. His mouth was opening and closing without sound. His jaw moved like a man trying to form words in a language he no longer spoke. He'd been walking toward the commotion, drawn by the voice of authority, and now he was backing away, step by step, his hands coming up in something that wasn't quite surrender but wasn't defiance either. It was the look of a man watching his entire architecture of control collapse in real time. The SEAL commander's voice followed Katie through the stairwell door. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. It was a statement. A fact. A recognition that echoed off tile and fluorescent-lit walls and sealed into the hospital's blood-like scar tissue. In room for 12, the former Taliban fighter who'd recognized her was crying silently, understanding finally who'd stood before him that morning with her hands moving on muscle memory, saving a life while hiding from her own, just another nurse in surgical scrubs, just another voice in the darkness saying the things people needed to hear when they were ready to stop fighting. Katie's boots, the colonel's worn combat boots from his bedside table, the pair his daughter had brought from home and left at the nurse's station with a note saying he always wants these nearby, these boots were no longer in her hospital locker. They were in her car now, waiting. She'd taken them when security walked her out Tuesday morning. She descended the stairs to the parking garage, each step measured, each breath controlled, and behind her in that hallway the truth was spreading like light under a door, finally being allowed to exist in the same room as the woman who'd carried it for 18 months. Friday morning arrived before anyone expected it. Marcus Chen, the hospital IT director, stood in the security office with his second cup of coffee and watched the monitors cycle through footage from the cardiac ICU. Chen had served 2 tours in Fallujah with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. He knew the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. When Sterling entered the security office at 0600 and requested routine footage review for the colonel's pneumothorax crisis, Chen's jaw tightened. The request itself wasn't unusual. The timing was everything. Sterling moved to the terminal with the casual authority of a man who'd never been told no by IT staff, and Chen watched in real time as Sterling's fingers moved across the keyboard. Delete. Confirm. Delete. The video showing Katie's 14-gauge needle decompression at the 2nd intercostal space, midclavicular line, the technical perfection of her intervention, was being erased from the server. Chen didn't move. Didn't speak. He simply watched Sterling attempt to bury the evidence of a life-saving procedure, frame by frame, timestamp by timestamp. At 0603, Chen locked the system. Sterling's fingers froze on the keyboard. Sir, systems locked per protocol. Nobody gets unauthorized deletions on high security admits. Chen's voice carried the flat precision of someone accustomed to command chains. I've logged this access attempt. Documented the deletion request. Saved every frame to external drive with timestamp verification. That's standard. Sterling's face cycled through several expressions, shock, calculation, then the forced smile of a man suddenly realizing the game had changed. He stood without speaking and walked out of the security office. Chen waited exactly 30 seconds, then picked up his phone. The State Medical Board answered on the 2nd ring. By Friday afternoon, Chen walked into the State Medical Board office with a sealed drive containing everything, the attempted deletion logs, the timestamp sequences, the video of Sterling's actions in the security terminal. He placed a formal complaint on the desk of the board's chief investigator and said only, "This is a physician attempting to destroy evidence of a life-saving intervention. That's misconduct. That's criminal." The board also received an anonymous package that Friday. Inside was documentation that made Sterling's career collapse not like dominoes but like a house of cards in a hurricane. His emails to board members planting seeds about Katie's stability. His phone logs showing calls to her nursing school references at 0500 hours with pointed questions designed to damage her professionally. His coordination with the risk management consultant, messages showing he'd arranged the termination letter before any investigation had occurred. Not quality control. Not patient safety. Vendetta. Personal destruction dressed in bureaucratic language. The pattern was undeniable, one physician's campaign to eliminate a nurse who'd threatened his authority in front of a patient's family. The 5 doctors submitted their statement jointly, Anderson, Patel, Chen, Rodriguez, and Garrett, all senior attending physicians in cardiothoracic surgery, all refusing to sign their names with Sterling's, all confirming in writing that Sterling had overruled their clinical recommendations, prevented them from attempting the thoracic procedure they collectively believed was medically indicated, and effectively abandoned their patient to comfort care. Their statement became part of the record. 5 physicians. One unanimous voice saying Sterling was wrong. The hospital board president received a letter from the Navy's Special Warfare Community Liaison Office marked official concern. The words were diplomatic, but the meaning was crystalline. The Naval Special Warfare Command was aware that a decorated senior chief petty officer had been terminated following a medical intervention that saved a Delta Force officer's life, and the command expected clarification on whether the hospital's actions reflected institutional policy toward Navy medical personnel. Not a threat. Worse, an official acknowledgement that Katie Morrison's service was known, recorded, and protected at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Sterling was placed on immediate administrative leave that Friday at 1,400 hours. His hospital credentials were suspended by 14:30. His access badge was deactivated by 1500. The security guards at the employee entrance didn't even need to be told, they simply watched as Sterling walked toward the parking garage, his ID no longer functional, his title no longer providing shelter. The silence in the hallway as he passed was the kind of quiet that comes before significant things change. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of a man walking away from everything he'd built. The cardiothoracic department held an emergency meeting Saturday morning. Anderson was named interim director of the department. The first vote was unanimous: rescind Katie Morrison's termination, offer full reinstatement with back pay calculated from Tuesday through the present date, and place her name on the schedule for Monday's shift. No discussion. No debate. 5 doctors stood and it was done. 6 months later, Sterling taught CPR fundamentals at Savannah Technical College for $18 an hour. His medical license carried a restriction: non-patient instruction only. He was no longer allowed within 50 feet of any clinical care area, any patient unit, any operating room. The cardiothoracic department at Sacred Heart Memorial Hospital was reorganized under Anderson's leadership, and the first policy revision mandated that all interventions of life-saving necessity would be performed immediately by the most qualified personnel available, regardless of hierarchical position. Katie's needle decompression had become protocol. It was written into the training now. Every resident and intern learned that procedure the way she'd performed it, with technical precision and the absolute certainty that speed saved lives. Room 407 of the cardiac ICU smelled like antiseptic and the faint metallic tang of healing. The colonel emerged from sedation on a Wednesday morning with his daughter standing vigil and Katie Morrison standing in the doorway wearing her navy dress blues for the first time in 18 months. The uniform fit like memory, pressed creases sharp enough to cut glass, ribbons arranged in the precise order of service and sacrifice. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Cross. The medals caught the morning light coming through the window. She'd worn them to the hospital because today was the day everything finally aligned. The colonel's eyes opened slowly, the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator giving way to natural breathing. His gaze focused on her face, the composure that had become legendary, the jaw that never broke, the eyes that had held his in Sangin when everything was burning. His pupils dilated with recognition, and then his eyes dropped to his own left forearm. The black letters were still there, still sharp after 18 years, Senior Chief Katie Morrison. He reached for the bedside table where his daughter had placed his worn combat boots, the ones that had been in Katie's locker for 18 months, the one she'd carried like sacred objects through her darkest hours. His hand shook, not from weakness but from the overwhelming awareness of what those boots represented. Someone who doesn't leave her people behind. Someone who carries them. Someone who finally came back. Senior Chief, he whispered, his voice rough from the endotracheal tube. You found me again. Katie moved into the room with the precision of someone who knew exactly who she was. She took his hand, and her own was steady. The trembling had finished its work months ago, burned away by the simple act of reclaiming her name. I never left, Colonel, she said. I never leave my people behind. His daughter embraced Katie in the hallway afterward, sobbing words of gratitude that didn't need translation. Behind them, 5 doctors stood at attention in the ICU doorway: Anderson, Patel, Chen, Rodriguez, and Garrett, their gesture of respect silent but unmistakable. The kind of respect that comes between people who understand what it means to keep someone alive, to refuse to let them go, to stand against every institutional pressure and say no, this is not how we do things, not on this day, not in this hospital, not when a life is on the line. The hospital dedicated a plaque in the cardiac ICU 2 months later. Brass and marble, with words that caught the light the way medals do, in honor of those who serve in uniform and in scrubs. Courage takes many forms. Katie Morrison walked these hallways now as Senior Chief Petty Officer, and the other nurses saluted when she passed. The combat boots were displayed in a shadow box in the colonel's room above a simple inscription: sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. She'd made her choice. She'd reclaimed her identity. And she'd stayed. This is where the truth lives, not in the things we hide, but in the ones we finally let be known. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe to see what happens when the real story emerges. Like this video. Comment below, would you have walked away, or would you have stayed? And check out the next segment to see what comes after the recognition. Thank you for watching.